Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. We are really excited to talk about this super pertinent topic in the Pacific Northwest, housing affordability and specifically parking and transportation policy, with bills being considered and passed up and down the West Coast that will facilitate and remove barriers to housing creation and specifically affordable housing creation. Quinn and I with Toole Design Group are really excited to talk about specific action steps that you and your community can take when it comes to creating a supportive environment with your parking and transportation policies for affordable housing development. So by way of introduction, my name is Mallory Baker. Again, very excited to be with you all this morning. I'm a planner by trade. I'm actually an East Coaster originally, but have spent the vast majority of my planning career in the West and Mountain West. I started originally doing primarily staff augmentation and really revitalization of community development departments in small and mid-sized communities, and just developed a huge passion for helping communities with these big existential challenges by really progressive planning policy and specifically transportation policy. I have the great pleasure now of leading Walker Consultants Planning Operations and Technology Practice in the Pacific Northwest. Walker is a broad-based transportation planning, design, and engineering firm with offices nationally. Our Pacific Northwest office is located in Seattle and Belltown. I'm going to kick it over to Quinn, who's my co-presenter for the day.
Yeah, thank you, Mallory. So yeah, my name is Quinn Kelly. I'm a planner at Toole Design based here in Seattle, Washington. I grew up in Arkansas and I also went to school in New York, but I now call the Pacific Northwest home. So yeah, here at Toole Design, we really focus on helping communities create equitable, sustainable, and inclusive transportation networks. And in my career, I've worked on everything from mobility justice research and transit-oriented development to the design of protected bike lanes and safe routes to school projects.
Thanks, Quinn. So now that we've introduced ourselves, we're really excited to learn a little bit more about you. And this is going to be a little bit experimental. We're going to be kind of switching back and forth between the PowerPoint and a Mentimeter deck. So we were really hopeful to get some interaction from this crew here today. So I'm going to share my Mentimeter screen in just a second here. Okay. So if you could go using your phone, or you can use your phone, you can use your laptop that you're watching this webinar on, you can go to menti.com. That's www.menti.com and use the code 37490622. And I'm going to copy and paste that into the chat window as well.
Beat you to it.
Great job, Quinn. Yep. He's one step ahead of me already. And this first question, what community or organization are you representing today? If you're having any challenges with Mentimeter, feel free to just throw your comments in the chat. Oh, and one more housekeeping issue, because this is a webinar, you are unable to unmute yourselves. So if you have any questions as we're going along, just press the Q&A button down at the bottom and put in your questions or comments there. Awesome, some great representation. TriMet, Kirkland, Linwood, all the way from Columbus, Ohio. Very exciting to have you join us today.
Rogers, Arkansas. I think I know who that is, and appreciate that showing today.
Awesome. Yeah, some representation from your home state there, Quinn.
Yep.
Very exciting. All right, let's go to the next question here. What is your job? So some of you already answered this question in the first one, but if you could share a little bit more about what you do every day. Awesome. Lots of active transportation focused folks, design managers, transportation planners. We have a huge soft spot for transportation planners, obviously, being transportation planners ourselves. City planning. Awesome. Civil engineers, some engineer versus planner activity going on here. That'll be that'll be an exciting dynamic. Cool. Well, thank you so much for answering those questions. We have a lot to cover in the presentation today, so we are going to get right to it. Going to bounce back to this presentation here. All right, there we go. So really this presentation focuses fundamentally on the relationship between transportation policy and housing affordability. And we really think this is kind of a newer concept for planners, for policymakers, and it's a concept that's starting to be recognized at state legislatures up and down the West Coast, across the country. Parking requirements, archaic transportation policies really do impact the ability of our communities to fulfill housing needs, and especially affordable housing needs. This graphic is from Denver Infill. I don't want to be too Denver focused here. Denver has a soft spot for me, but Denver Infill did a study a couple of years back on how much mass and land is taken up by parking in downtown Denver. So this is really just a visualization of just how much in green parking takes up of our cities, of our communities, and what parking requirements, lender requirements related to parking do in terms of our opportunity cost. But parking isn't just an opportunity cost and a land cost. It's also an actual cost for projects, and typically a cost that's passed down directly to our tenants, to the people who live, work, and play in our buildings, in our cities, and our communities. Typically, parking takes up between 10 and 20% of development budgets, which is a really huge chunk when you think about how much goes into to creating a development, and specifically a housing development. Just by way of an example, the LA Philharmonic was constructed recently. It cost $274 million to build a beautiful building. $100 million of that, or about 40%, went to the underground parking structure. So that's a massive amount of money that goes to parking, and ultimately we end up paying for that cost. But it's not just about these costs. Parking requirements specifically also lend a political angle that is often used to kill much needed affordable housing projects. These are some examples just in the last couple of years. Dorchester, Massachusetts, Denver, Colorado, two hugely different communities, but both experiencing the same thing. Stringent parking requirements where, affordable housing projects coming online, going through a site development planning process, cannot meet the requirements or seek a variance. And this is used as sort of a political angle to kill much needed affordable housing stock in our communities. But Quinn, maybe you can put a more positive spin on this and talk a little bit more about how we can convert the conversation from parking to access to our buildings and our communities.
Yeah, thanks. So yeah, as Mallory kind of laid out, it's really critical to think about these connections between land use and transportation. If we want to decrease the demand for parking, we really have to create alternative options for folks to reduce their need to rely solely on private vehicles. So yeah, this means creating quality transportation options that actually make it feasible for families to either reduce the number of vehicles that they have or forgo vehicle ownership altogether. In addition to reducing parking demand, reducing reliance on private vehicles can also improve the overall financial health of low-income households. The average annual cost of a new vehicle is over $9,000. And obviously older vehicles come with their own costs and challenges in terms of reliability. Households in auto-dependent neighborhoods spend roughly 25% of their income on transportation, but this number drops to 9% in neighborhoods that have a greater variety of mobility options.
Thanks, Quinn. So typically when we think about innovation in housing or innovation in our planning spaces, we always think about the market kind of driving things, but we want to start with cities, with communities, and the regulatory context. We think that there's a huge opportunity here for communities like you all on this call to facilitate an environment that supports housing affordability, supports housing creation with some changes to your regulations when it comes to parking. So we're going to start with parking, and then we're going to talk a little bit more about the broader multimodal context. So typically when we talk about regulatory interventions to facilitate development, housing creation, housing affordability, we always talk about eliminating parking requirements, right? That's Don Shoup's, Don Shoup, big parking focused urban planner at UCLA. He always talks about eliminating parking requirements. That's the next step. That's the right thing. That's the progressive move. But not all communities are, Seattle, Portland, many communities struggle with just basic access, basic multimodal networks, and still are heavily reliant on single occupancy vehicles and really focus on use-based requirements for new development. So making incremental changes can still move you towards facilitating a more supportive environment for housing availability and affordability, if that is your goal. So this scale really shows that, no matter where you are on the scale, whether you're just focused on use-based requirements and kind of finding another way to move the needle a bit, or you're all the way at the other end of the spectrum, focusing not on parking requirements, but on requiring a focus on other modes, you can make a jump, you can make a dent, you can move along the scale to create a more supportive environment. And really, there's so much diversity in our communities that there's no one size fits all approach. Just as an example, we're working on a parking ordinance for Los Angeles County, with the specific goal of increasing affordable housing stock. And just in Los Angeles County, that's one county, but there are so many diverse communities, contexts, perspectives. So there's not just one answer. There are different ways that we need to skin the cat, if you will. So I'm going to talk about some different interventions on kind of the low side, just starting, the mid-range, and then all the way up at the high end, and get kind of specific and granular. So starting on the low end, if you're just starting with use-based parking requirements, you might consider moving away from board and commission, elected appointed body approvals of parking reductions or variances to allowing for more prescriptive, limited, but administrative and staff-led reductions. With board and commission approvals of reductions, if that's your only option, it really adds a ton of ambiguity, a ton of politics, frankly, and a lot of time to the process. It adds cost, it adds a lot of headache on the part of developers and on the part of staff. So having some administrative staff-led reductions that are specifically tied to interventions, initiatives, programmatic elements, or conditions that your community wants to facilitate, that can be a really powerful tool that can integrate well into your use-based parking requirements. Some examples, many communities have these regulatory interventions, might be some administrative reductions for a robust bike share program, a robust car share program, proximity to transit stops if you're in a suburban context. In terms of preconditions, what do you have to make this work in your community? Really nothing. Any community, suburban, rural, a cityscape can have this regulatory intervention and make it work with success. Pros here, standardized formatting, right? So administrative prescriptive requirements can really fall into your existing use-based requirements that you have already. So they're really simple to administer and really cater well to a simple, simply facilitated site development planning process. Some pitfalls here. So one thing we always see is communities who have a substantial reduction allowance for underground parking, for example. Building parking underground adds cost, and it doesn't have any impact on actual parking demand. So you want to tie available reductions to things that are reducing costs ultimately to tenants and have an actual reductive effect on parking demand. So for example, car share has a well-documented, demonstrated reduction impact on parking demand itself. The impact on affordable housing creation, pretty low, right? You might make a little bit of a dent on the development budget when it comes to building parking, but really what this does is have developers have some skin in the game when it comes to creating a more accessible environment for their tenants, for their building users, and reducing reliance on single occupancy vehicles in your community. A mid-level intervention that you might consider is an as-of-right reduction in core areas. So what a core area might be kind of dependent on your community, but many communities have such reductions. For example, Everett, Washington, Beaverton, Oregon. Those are examples of communities that have these percentage-based or alternative minimum parking standards in core areas within their communities. Some preconditions here, you really need to have a thoughtful criteria-based establishment of what areas you want to focus on, where you want to have these parking reductions. And we'll talk a little bit more about that criteria soon. And in those areas where you have reduced parking requirements, you should be looking at how are you managing your publicly available parking resources, which are likely going to see an impact if you reduce parking requirements. Are you managing them actively? Are you getting a lot of complaints? What are you doing to address those complaints upfront? Some pros here, you really have a substantial alignment with broader planning objectives and potential for community buy-in. So this regulatory intervention really feeds well if you have your transportation master planning process, if you have your comp planning process, and you've identified areas in your community where you want to focus on multimodal networks, where you want to reduce reliance on single occupancy vehicles. This is a great implementation step. Some pitfalls here, it really does set up certain areas of the community for more success and attention. And that's common in any scenario if you are, focusing on specific core areas in your community. And we'll talk about how you might establish those core areas, but you're also setting those areas up for heightened scrutiny. We talked about the importance of looking at how you're managing parking in those areas, because again, you're going to see impacts on the public parking resources when you reduce parking, at least for the first couple of years, as you bolster your multimodal network. So be prepared for that. The impact here, it's mid-level. It can substantially reduce costs for development that are passed on to tenants, depending on the size and scale of the reduction, meaning the size of the percentage reduction and the boundary of the area where it's applied. And then we're getting into the higher level regulatory interventions. So this is where you actually are talking about, eliminating parking requirements altogether. Generally not citywide, even Portland is one of the only communities, Buffalo, New York, that has citywide elimination of parking requirements for most or many uses. But most communities still have, in more suburban or less multimodal areas, you would still have parking requirements. But if you're looking towards eliminating parking requirements in core areas, or you're considering reconfiguring the provision of new parking that's tied to a certain use or development as a financial contribution rather to the public parking resources. So that's where we start talking about in lieu fees, usage fees, those kinds of things. Kirkland, Washington, here today, and an example of a community that has an in lieu fee program in their code. And typically, those funds raised go towards managing those public parking resources, or even in addition to public parking resources, maybe they go towards transportation demand management programs. Boulder, Colorado is an example there. So the precondition here, you really want to have existing public parking resources, and or you want to have a rich multimodal network. Pros, you're maximizing impact with these efforts, and you're supporting your public transportation and parking resources. You're saying, we're taking ownership of this. This is a public good. This is not an individual endeavor. This is something that we are sharing together. The pitfalls here, you're really setting yourself up for the need to self-manage access, self-manage parking. That's not something that every city or community is willing or interested in doing. And administering successful in lieu fee programs is hard, and you have to have a certain development pace to raise enough cash to make them worthwhile, but the impact can be quite high. And finally, moving towards focusing requirements rather than on parking on transportation demand management and accommodating travel choices beyond the single occupancy vehicle. Everett, Washington has a transportation demand management plan requirement. Denver, Colorado, a recent inductee into this club, their TDM program has a little bit more teeth and has prescriptive requirements when it comes to requirements to reduce single occupancy vehicle arrivals. Preconditions here, you need rich multimodal networks to make this work. The pros, this fosters a truly multimodal community, and it really brings developers into a collaborative approach to TDM, to multimodal environments. And you're replacing parking requirements rather than just saying, well, no more access, we don't care about it. You're replacing that parking with something new, something more focused on other modes of transportation. But getting teeth to these, managing and monitoring them is quite hard. The impact can be quite high when coupled with other regulatory initiatives like the ones we've been discussing. So in terms of setting the stage, we talked a lot about core areas. Well, what are core areas? How do you identify them? The most traditional ways are to focus on access and density. So, Lloyd District in Portland, for example, 38th and Blake in Denver, a lot of the core areas in Portland, Seattle, some of the major cities, most of the downtown areas, like in downtown Tacoma, where there's a waiver reduction of parking requirements. Those places have rich multimodal networks, they're dense. So in order to collect data and really identify those core areas, you want to focus on what's the access scoring, walk, bike, transit score in those areas. You want to look at commute surveys. So how are people getting around? How are they using bike, transit currently to get around? And you could look also at the floor area ratio and residential density in these areas. A secondary way of identifying core areas might be to focus on existing parking availability. So if you have, sort of a build it and they will come approach. We actually worked with the city of Gilbert, Arizona. They built a massive parking garage and then just waived parking requirements for new development coming online because they already had the parking. So if you have an area in your community that has a ton of publicly available underutilized parking, this might be an approach that you could take. And finally, a pretty novel approach you could take is to actually focus on areas that really desperately need affordable housing stock. So there you might look at area median income, the percentage of income spent on housing in those areas, and finally the year-over-year increases in housing prices. So now we're going to switch back over to Mentimeter and learn a little, just to have a couple quick questions on parking regs in your community, so we can talk a little bit more specifically on what these things look like for you. So if you want to go back to Mentimeter, menti.com, www.menti.com, it's in the chat, and use the code 37490622. If you remember this scale, this housing availability and affordability regulation scale, we want to know where you fall on the scale. Where does your community land? So from, you're focusing on use-based parking requirements all the way up to you've eliminated parking requirements in some areas and you're focused on managing other modes of transportation, or maybe you're doing something else entirely that we haven't even thought of. Also, I'm seeing some responses come in. Yeah, and if you're just, mostly administering use-based parking requirements, that's a condition that the vast majority of communities in this country, that's where most folks are at. So there is a lot of opportunity for growth, and I think that's really exciting. Awesome. All right. So we're going to move on to the next question in 3, 2, 1. Okay, this is the second question we'll do here, and then we'll move back to the presentation. What do you see as the biggest barrier to adopting a more housing-friendly parking policy? Politics, that's a pretty broad term. You can interpret that on your own. Oh yeah, okay, so that's a popular answer. We're already working on it. Maybe the community has little interest. I think politics is a big one. This is a really challenging topic in Los Angeles County. A pretty progressive county that's excited about understands the importance of more affordable housing stock. There's not one person that we've talked to that says we don't want more affordable housing, but what they say is parking is important to us. It's an emotional topic to us. So they're really more focused on the importance of parking management than building affordable housing. So these are really hard conversations that you all are having. Awesome. So in the interest of time, we're going to move back into the presentation here and just jump right back in. So now we're going to talk about supportive policies to facilitate change in your community. So this is where we're really digging into, okay, if you make the changes on the regulatory side, what are the other conditions? What are the other changes that you can make to really make your community more multimodal, make it more palatable for folks to exist without a car and not rely so much on parking assets? So Quinn's going to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I think, as we've sort of established, there's a lot of advantages to creating a more robust sort of menu of mobility options. But, how can cities make sure that they're using their right of way in the best way possible to promote multimodal transportation? Complete streets, I'm sure, is a term that most of you have encountered at least. At its core, it's the idea that streets should be planned, designed, and operated to promote the safety and convenience and comfort of all users. Implementing complete streets really starts with establishing a clear set of standards about how to prioritize and accommodate different modes within the constraints of a limited right-of-way. So if you see the image on the left, this is from a guide that Toole Design worked with the city of Seattle developed called Streets Illustrated. So it's an equity-driven approach to project selection, outreach, design, and implementation of the right-of-way. And the idea here is it really makes it easier for developers and designers and community advocates to reshape the right-of-way to meet local needs by providing simple guidance and streamlining processes. And it also helps to align decisions about the city's right-of-way with the city's larger goals, including the goal to encourage more people to walk, bike, and use public transportation. And it matches street types to the neighborhoods that they serve. So it acknowledges that not all streets are, necessarily serving the same kind of context. So, and now Mallory's going to touch on curb management, which is another really critical piece of complete street design.
Yeah, thanks, Quinn. So once you have this design and once you've sort of allocated the physical resources, it's really important to think about the actual operation of the curb. And I touched on the importance and the kind of precondition of understanding, are you managing parking? Are you actively managing your right of way and how that's allocated? Because when you move forward in this regulatory environment and you adjust how developers are providing parking for their own businesses, you are going to get more pressure on your right of way, and it is going to become more of a shared public space. So really making sure that your operations, your ordinances, your administration, your enforcement is supportive and in line with effective allocation and operation of that right of way, especially when it comes to parking. So I think what Quinn, maybe I'll cue this up because I wanted to share a little bit about why we were focusing on bicycles, and then what we'll talk later about some other transportation modes. And we really wanted to dig into two kind of transportation options for short trips in more dense environments. And then, some of you are coming from suburban, rural, far-reaching contexts where people are driving, 10, 20 minutes just to get to grocery stores, doctor's appointments, et cetera. So we wanted to focus on kind of two different ways to really make a big impact in the multimodal environment with these uses.
Yeah, so, obviously, bikes are a great way to get people out of their cars, especially for shorter urban trips. They offer a ton of benefits, both the people using them and for society as a whole. But biking doesn't really feel like a great option for a lot of folks. And a lot of that has to do with the existing infrastructure. So our experience has shown us that if we build bike networks that feel safe and convenient, there's really a huge potential to get a lot more people on bikes. So bike networks should be designed with a specific target user in mind. So looking at this graphic here, you can see that interested but concerned cyclists make up the majority of potential users. And networks that designed for this user type are supportive of more confident users as well. Next slide. So yeah, a safe and comfortable and connected bike network is a purposeful combination of different bikeway types. So some bike facilities provide more separation from cars, especially on roadways with high motor vehicle volumes and high speeds. And these are going to be a lot more comfortable and appealing for a broader range of people. Next. So yeah, and then in the context of building a bike network, also thinking about equity, which equity is not just about coverage. It's not just about, giving a little bit to everyone. That's equality, and it doesn't really, suit individual and, local neighborhood needs. So it's really about listening to, communities and identifying ways to meaningfully improve their mobility options. Next. So yeah, I want to contrast that to, the way that many cities implement bikeways today, which, yeah, as you see, incrementally, opportunistically, timidly, and politically. And this really results in a disjointed network that leaves many would-be riders feeling frustrated and unsafe. Um, so I'm going to talk about, a project that Toole Design did with the city of New Orleans to identify a better way to support sustainable mode shift through the rapid implementation of a cohesive, all ages, all abilities bike network. Next. So as part of their overall transportation strategy, the city of New Orleans envisioned a network of 75 miles of low stress bikeways that could be built in 2 years. So this was pretty bold, but it was a 3-team partnership between the city, People for Bikes, and a local bike advocacy organization called Bike Easy. Next slide. So we started out this project with an engagement process that asked people for feedback on what people like or dislike about different bikeway types. And we used that feedback to develop design standards and decision-making frameworks that would determine facility types and would also determine priorities for where this initial network of 75 miles would go. Next. And our engagement process also informed a set of guiding principles for the project. We wanted a network that was low stress, connected, useful, timely, and equitable. Next. And then, yeah, we use these decision-making frameworks and principles to plan and design a network of low-stress bikeways. And this is an example of one of the designs, which uses super inexpensive materials like paint and flexible bollards to rapidly transform the right-of-way into something that, a wide swath of people would feel comfortable biking through. Next slide. And here's some images of what it looks like on the ground. You can see these facilities are, they're very simple, but they provide separation from traffic either through physical barriers or rows of parked vehicles adjacent to the lane. Now Mallory's going to talk about a more rural example.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks, Quinn. So bikes are amazing in denser environments and for shorter trips. And not all of you are coming from environments where people can use active transportation, unfortunately, for typical trips. I myself live in a rural community, so I travel about 20 minutes to go to the grocery store at times. And I know many other communities that we work with struggle with this issue. And in the Pacific Northwest, it's not just Seattle and Portland. There are many different types of communities, many rural communities, many suburban communities where people are traveling 10, 20 minutes just to go to the doctor, go to the grocery store, pick up their kids from school. So how do you facilitate, multimodal transportation, a reduced reliance on parking on single occupancy vehicles in environments where there is no fixed route, where there's not the density for active transportation? So we worked with Fresno County Rural Transit Authority in Fresno County, Fresno County, California, to develop an on-demand, inexpensive, 100% electric, so zero emissions, point-to-point rideshare program for primarily rural Californians who had little to no transportation options and were reliant on, their one-car households or borrowing a car from a neighbor to go to the doctor, go to the grocery store. So that really made a big impact in allowing these households to reduce their reliance on personal vehicles and facilitate the kind of regulatory shifts that we're talking about. And we did something similar in Treasure Valley, Idaho. Treasure Valley, it includes Ada and Canyon counties. Ada County is, of course, where the city of Boise is. So there is some urban density there, but primarily those counties are pretty spread out. They cover a lot of ground. People are traveling pretty far for their work, for school, to run errands. So we focused for Valley Regional Transit, the transit agency, where they did not have fixed route service. We focused on expansion of van pool, employer pool, and on-demand options for residents with no access to fixed route transportation. that were heavily reliant on single occupancy vehicle travel. And we focused primarily on serving lower income communities and households that had one or fewer cars. So these were people that had little to no transportation options. So again, these are ways overall that you can really bolster the multimodal network beyond kind of the traditional, not everyone can put in light rail, not everyone can put in fixed route. Those are expensive initiatives that don't work in some environments. So thinking about options like bike, active transportation, and some of these non-traditional approaches with on-demand service can really bolster your network when you're kind of, racking your brain for ways to make people less reliant on their cars. So we'd love to learn a little bit more about your multimodal networks. I'm going to switch back to Mentimeter. I know this is probably getting tiresome, but if you could go back to menti.com, www.menti.com, and use the code 37490622. In what ways has your community worked towards a supportive multimodal environment? So we'd love to hear about some of the things that you're working on. We made this a scale. So if you're kind of like, we started this, we haven't really, made a lot of progress on it, you can still move the button a little bit and give yourself some credit for making some headway and some progress. So we have a lot of folks who have are creating, in the process of creating, or have adopted a complete streets policy, working on bicycle and pedestrian plans or transit infrastructure programs. On the implementation side, creating and adopting climate action plans, working on TMPs, working on TDM programs. Awesome progress here from these communities. Really exciting to see.
Yeah, so I think one thing I'm seeing in these results is, sometimes it's easier to come up with the plan than to actually implement it. But, yeah, we're all somewhere in that process.
Yeah, in that spectrum. Yeah, implementation is really hard, and a lot of the times, it's easy to have a great vision, but when it comes to actually, doing the community, getting the community buy-in, getting the political buy-in, getting the funding to move forward, it's a hard road. So we're going to move on to what extent the following factors are barriers to in your community to building a more robust multimodal network. So you might be familiar with some of these things. Quinn and I were actually talking yesterday about what could be the barriers, and one thing that popped into our heads was the car travel and parking. These are such emotional topics for people, and having worked in parking and transportation for a long time and leading our community engagement practice, I have a lot of those really emotional conversations. I think Quinn and I sometimes double as therapists in a lot of ways for people as they navigate their access challenges, and I'm sure you all do too. Yeah, parking, car travel are big ones, Quinn, not surprising.
Mm-hmm.
Safety, lack of staff resources and expertise, funding, another big one. It's fun. Oh, sorry.
I was gonna say, yeah, there's interest from the community until it comes time to actually, make trade-offs. That interest becomes a little less committal.
Yeah. Mentimeter is cool too, because we can see the distribution here, which is always fun. I just love that. Okay, awesome. So we're going to switch back for just a couple more slides, and then we'll get back to the Mentimeter and have some time for Q&A. So maybe the most important aspect, you go to a lot of webinars, I'm sure you have a lot of these types of conversations, but hopefully you can take something away from this and, do the next right thing for your community. And that'll be dependent on your role and your community context, right? So we'll talk a little bit about what we want to hear from you, what you think your next right thing is, but just a couple kind of broad points. You really want to find your why. Housing affordability, building more housing, transportation policy and parking policy are really, really broad. So figuring out, do you want to build more middle income housing, more low income housing? Do you want to focus just more on broad multimodal networks and facilitating a community that's less reliant on parking and on single occupancy vehicles? What is your why? That will really help inform kind of what your next step looks like and what your data collection process looks like. So in any case, we really think a robust data collection is so important for many reasons. A, to pinpoint, what your regulations might look like, what your multimodal network steps might look like, and also to help prime the pipe for easy implementation and a strong community process. You want to start with having strong data, strong justification for why you're doing this and why you're doing this now. Community engagement, these are hot topics. Parking and transportation, kind of a snooze fest for a lot of people. Quinn and I are special. We really care about parking and transportation. A lot of people, when you start talking about parking and transportation, their eyes kind of roll to the back of their head. They start to fall asleep. So, however, your community is going to be really invested in these topics, especially when it comes to parking. Having had a ton of conversations about parking over the years, it gets really heated. And so making sure your community is engaged. And I'm sure, Quinn can tell stories about bike lanes and multimodal infrastructure development too, really engaging your community meaningfully, making sure they're an active and included part of your process, and engaging your elected and appointed officials early on in the process, building a shared vision of success together, figuring out, what mountain you're climbing. So to wrap up, we're going to do one more Mentimeter question, and this will kind of roll into our Q&A. And I can see we have a lot of comments in the chat already. So we are going to do one more question on Mentimeter. When it comes, so switching back to Mentimeter, if you go to menti.com, again, the code 37490622. When it comes to parking and transportation policies in your community, what is the next step you're hoping to take? So we'd love to hear from you. What is your next right thing? Let's see what your responses are. Get cities to reduce their parking ratio requirements. Yeah, that's a tough lobbying effort. Creating better first and last mile connections to transit. I think that's a really, really important one, and really ties into what we were talking about. We're talking about creating a multimodal network where there isn't a ton of fixed route transit service. Reducing requirements and right sizing parking in downtown, exploring shared parking opportunities, middle housing zoning code, cohesive plan across the city. Yeah. Higher parking fees. Yes, love to see that. And I think this really ties in, like, parking management is such like a big conversation when it comes to facilitating multimodal access and reducing reliance on personal vehicles. It's so important to manage your parking.
Yeah, and also more dynamic management. I think that's another great one, because we're also in a space where the technology is changing really fast in terms of what's possible in terms of managing parking fees over time to make sure that you're keeping good allocation.
Yeah, also, okay, the strategies you provided us today will help us educate our commissions and boards for positive change. Yay, we're so excited to hear that. We love hearing that our webinars are useful. That's our goal, right? Awesome. Well, I think we'll share our screen so we can share our contact info, and we can move on to Q&A. We have some Q&A in the chat, Quinn, that you and I can parse through. So again, we're here to help. We are complete nerds when it comes to these topics. Like, we love talking about this stuff. So, and we know that you all, especially those of you who work for cities and towns, like, you have a hard road ahead if you've identified this as your goal. So we're here to be a resource, and we're really excited to talk to you about this and continue the conversation. So I'm going to kick it over to the chat. Okay, so in the Q&A, and I mistook the chat for the Q&A. So we have one question so far. How can we better match residents who use transit with transit-rich locations and reduce parking? That is a really good question. I think, yeah, I think it starts first with working actively with the developers who work in your community and understanding the market that they're sort of approaching when it comes to the tenants that they're attracting with their leasing arrangements and their new developments. I think a lot of developers have the same goal of finding tenants who match the amenities in a building and the location of a building. So this is kind of a shared goal for both city and developer. So I would say doing some stakeholder engagement with your developers is a really important first step. And I think that's with our ordinance work in Los Angeles County, that's one of the things that we're doing is we are actively on the ground talking to housing developers to understand who their tenants are, what the needs are. The other thing is understanding where you're at currently in terms of your mode split. So most communities that we work in, and Quinn, I don't know about you, have a pretty low understanding of what the mode split in their community is. They use census tract data, which is pretty all over the place in terms of margin of error and does not offer a really accurate picture of your specific community and specific neighborhoods. So I would start with doing some data collection to understand, have a granular understanding of mode shift and mode split in your different neighborhoods where you're considering enacting, say, a TOD kind of parking policy. And then seeing kind of how far you need to go. And then you can, again, set those core areas to understand where you should be reducing parking requirements adjacent to transit stations or potentially in areas that have more multimodal density that doesn't have to do with transit and fixed route.
Yeah, I wanted to add also, here in Seattle, our regional transit provider, Sound Transit, is directly involved in TOD. So, when they go to build a project, there's surplus land left over around the stations and tracks, and they are very deliberate about managing that and partnering directly with developers, nonprofit and for-profit developers, to build housing that is, has a very high threshold for affordable units.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I think too, one thing that helps with that particular issue is unbundling parking. So when we talk about unbundling parking, it means separating the cost of parking from the cost of a housing unit. And it's hard to legislate and regulate, but there are communities that do it, and you could encourage it among developers and owners of housing properties. And that allows for residents to sort of choose and opt in to parking rather than opting out or just having it assumed as part of their cost of housing. So that reduces costs and also kind of better matches residents who might be more multimodal minded or use transit more actively with units and with housing options where parking isn't sort of an automatic thing. So from Doreen, can you go back to the network concept and discuss the nodes where people change modes, for instance, car to bike downtown instead of just parking? Quinn, do you want to address kind of trips with multiple transportation modes?
Yeah,
included?
I think I wasn't sure if I was interpreting that question correctly, but yeah, definitely, having allowing for multimodal trips is can be huge. Even something as simple as just having bike racks on the front of buses, and little ways for people to combine those modes and trips can hugely increase. It helps more people take transit because they might not live close enough to a station to walk there, but biking there might be an option. And similarly, it helps people biking because they might live a little too far to bike to their destination, but with transit, it really enables a lot more single occupancy vehicle oriented trips.
Yeah.
But yeah.
And Doreen, I'm not sure what your context is or what your job is, whether you work for a city or town or something else, but remote parking, you know, when a community does decide to manage public parking resources on its own, it has more authority and power over where that parking is located and what trips to that parking and from that parking look like. So for example, we're working currently with the city of Santa Fe on a multimodal plan, and they don't want really any parking in their down. They don't want traffic or circulation in their downtown core. They really want people to move to active transportation and transit in the downtown core. So they're really leveraging remote parking resources, especially during events, to facilitate kind of like a park once remote situation, and then facilitate a multimodal trip where you park remotely outside the downtown, and maybe you have some bike share stations or allow for people to bring personal bikes. And I do think the advent of micromobility and facilitating more micromobility parking and options like bike share, like scooter share, can really make remote parking and a park once policy work better. Just because a lot of people don't like to walk very far, but biking and scootering can help people make that transition. Is there a collection or clearinghouse of facts on the cost of parking on a square foot basis compared with land uses, say housing, and cities, towns, or counties who have implemented no parking or reduced parking in their zoning code? The second one, yes, I have a link, Marcy, that I can send you. There's sort of a crowdsourced map of communities that have eliminated parking either in certain areas or in its entirety in their city proper. So I can send that to you. The first one, unfortunately, it's so dependent on location. And even within a city, it's dependent on location and what type of parking you're building, and other things like the water table if you're going underground, or the type of like ground that you're building in. It's so dependent. We probably have we do design here and structural engineering, so I can ping that question to some other folks and see if there's some kind of like clearinghouse that's regional, but it's very, very variable, I would say. So it would be hard to get like a precise answer. From Fiona, how can a transit agency that doesn't have any land use authority influence the development and parking ratios adjacent to our light rail stations? Okay, I have some thoughts on this. I was reading this question and thinking about it. So the Regional Transportation District in Colorado recently did a study on usage of parking at TOD sites in residential at residential buildings on TOD sites. And basically what they found is parking on those sites is about 50% utilized across the board. So that really, the publishing of that paper and the sharing of that information has started to influence city requirements in Colorado, but I would say it's a little bit of a lobbying game. For example, we're currently working, again, as I said, with Valley Regional Transit on that expansion of van pool and employer pool and on-demand options. We're wrapping up that study now. And one of our efforts was kind of like a marketing and partnerships initiative. And one of that is having this sort of static policy platform that says, hey, cities, here's what you can do to help us make the multimodal network better. Here's what you can do on your parking regulation side. You can, have these reductions in parking requirements. You can support unbundling parking from leases. And so having kind of that policy white paper and spreading that out among cities, and also just having partnerships with municipal agencies and asking them, hey, do you do anything to support transit or multimodal networks currently, and kind of having an understanding of what they're already doing or considering in their parking code would all be good ways. But aside from that, I don't have any amazing like magic silver bullet ideas. Quinn, anything from you on that?
No, I think, yeah, you covered it pretty well.
From Marcy, how many times have you worked on or seen this tactic taken, where a transportation demand management program provides a coach to individually coach people who want to change modes. For example, figure out how to commute comfortably by bike, find a safe route, secure parking, good clothing, etc. I've seen a number of, especially larger employers are big ones that have, like Amazon, Microsoft, Patagonia, all large employers that have transportation demand or commute coordinators. So those are actual positions in the organization. That's really like a human resources or employer service option where that it's like a person or people who have those conversations. But there are also programs that do that. For example, Commutify, Ride Amigos, both programs that facilitate smart commuting and transportation demand management programs, and can even facilitate like incentive-based programs or like parking cash out programs as well. Awesome. Any other questions or comments? Oh yeah, of course, happy to help, Marcy. From Diane, is the New Orleans bike plan required to be looked at by new developers that are bringing in more users in the area, in the sense that there will be an increase in bike modal use? Quinn?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, yeah, so generally, you know, that's a big part. I mean, going back to sort of like the traditional approach to, you know, bike network implementation, obviously it's very important to leverage development to get things built. But one thing that was sort of like, you know, unique about this approach in New Orleans is, you know, they aren't going to wait for that to happen. So, you know, rather than sort of like letting things happen incrementally, you know, they just go through and build out all of these lanes, like just using relatively inexpensive quick build materials. But then going back to the development, you know, once you have something in the right of way and, you know, very much appreciated and valued by the public, then, you know, when you do get a development, you know, you can say, okay, well, there's this great bike lane in front of your development. So as part of your pavement plan, you know, you should, or not you should, you have to build it out in, you know, more permanent materials, maybe with landscaping and, you know, other more permanent elements. So I think, yeah, there's a great there's definitely some great ways to, you know, still have the city sort of taking the lead in terms of figuring out, you know, building out a connected network that you know, has a sort of like an equity focus, but then also leveraging development to further improve and build out that network. So
great. Well, I think that was our last question. So if there's nothing else, we will go ahead and give you back like 90 seconds in your it's your day. Thank you all so much for joining us today. It's been a pleasure. Oh, I think we have one more question, maybe potentially. Oh, so awesome. Thank you both. Okay, thank you so much, Fiona. It was so great having you here today. And yeah, we love compliments. Keep them coming. Contact us if you have questions. We'd love, again, to keep the conversation going. And really appreciate you being here today. So have a great rest of your day. And Quinn and I hope to talk to you again soon.